Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us. My name is Leon Hartwell. I'm a Sotrov Fellow here at LSE IDEAS. I welcome to another LSE IDEAS Russia-Ukraine dialogue. We've set up the dialogues in response to the February escalation of the war, which is one of the most consequential events of our time. The conflict continues to be fluid and requires cross-disciplinary analysis. Our dialogues take place every Tuesday at the same time. In terms of status updates, according to the UNHCR, there are now more than 4.5 million Ukrainian refugees. In addition to major atrocities in Bucha, we have also seen evidence of war crimes committed in Kramatorsk following Russian bombing of a railway station, which caused the deaths of at least 57 Ukrainians. Like the Bosnian Serbs who notoriously bombed the Markale in Sarajevo in 1994 and again in 1995, Russia, the perpetrator, is blaming the bombing of the railway station on the victims. Ukraine's foreign minister said it would be extremely difficult to negotiate with Russia following the escalation of atrocities. Russia has defaulted on its foreign debt. It is what is called selective default, but a default nonetheless. While the Russian economy could contract by 15% as a result of Western sanctions, the World Bank warned that the Ukrainian economy will shrink by an astounding 51% this year. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce our panelists for today. First up, we have Olga Tokariuk. She is a non-resident fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis and an independent journalist and researcher based in Ukraine. Her professional interests include Ukrainian politics, international affairs, and the study of disinformation and its impact on democracies worldwide. Secondly, I have George Magnus, who is an independent economist and commentator and a research associate at the China Center at Oxford University and the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. George was the chief economist and then senior economic advisor at UBS Investment Bank. His latest book is called Red Flags, Why Xi's China is in Jeopardy. And finally, it's my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Mariah Thornton. She is a PhD student at the Department of International Relations and a researcher at LSE IDEAS. Now, Olga, I would first like to turn to you, so if you could unmute for me, please. You are on the ground in Ukraine. I would be very interested, firstly, what it is like to be a journalist in Ukraine today. And tied to that, maybe for your opening remarks, what are your key observations from the last few weeks? And also, given Russia's withdrawal in some areas in order to concentrate its forces on the east and south, while Ukraine is receiving additional support from NATO member states, what are you expecting to happen in the coming days and weeks? Thank you.
Hello, Leon. Hello, everyone, and thank you for having me at this event. Well, I've been living in Kyiv for 20 years. I had to leave my beloved city that I consider my home because of war. I'm currently in Western Ukraine. I intend to stay here for as long as I can. I went here, first of all, out of, the safety concerns for my child. I didn't want, my daughter to witness the war, to risk her life and safety. But I don't want to leave Ukraine either because I see it as, some sort of goal and the mission at this moment to continue being here, reporting, telling the world what is happening, and somehow contributing to this huge and impressive resistance effort that all the world has been admiring in the last weeks. Ukrainian people have really proven wrong many analysts and many policymakers who were predicting a quick surrender or quick defeat of Ukrainian military in this war. There were estimates that said that in 72 hours, Kyiv would be taken by Russians and a large part of Ukrainian territory would fall under the Russian occupation in a relatively short period of time. This didn't happen. Almost 2 months, since Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine on February 24. we are seeing that Russia failed to capture any major Ukrainian city, with the exception of Kherson in southern Ukraine, and the Russian occupiers, even there, they have troubles actually with controlling the city, because there is a significant protest movement among the population. People are going out to protest despite risks that it carries for them, despite the fact that the activists are being kidnapped and intimidated, the journalists are disappearing, that local politicians are also being abducted, and we are hearing accounts of possible torture and rape and extrajudicial killings being committed in southern Ukraine by Russian occupiers, the way that we already know, and we already have evidence that these crimes have been committed in northern parts of the country, in Kyiv region, in Chernihiv region, in Sumy region. The evidence of these crimes has emerged, especially during the last week, after Russian forces were basically kicked out of northern parts of Ukraine by the Ukrainian military. Large swaths of Ukrainian territory have been liberated by Ukrainian forces, but what we've seen there, and what the journalists also have seen there who entered these territories, it's a shocking evidence of massacre of civilians. The Bucha is the case in point. Everybody have heard about it, but it's not just Bucha. It's also Borodyanka, where entire residential blocks were leveled, by Russian shelling, by Russian airstrikes. Rescuers were not allowed to approach the rubble of, this residential blocks to extract people who are begging for help, trapped in the basements under these buildings for days. Rescuers were shot at, and people were basically left to die slowly under the rubble of these buildings. Extrajudicial killings and torture and rape have been committed by Russian soldiers also in other parts of Kyiv region, in Makariv, in Ivankiv, in another small towns and villages that no one outside of Ukraine have heard of until recently, and more evidence of these crimes is emerging every day. The work of journalists, of course, in this war has been extremely dangerous, and I'm very heartbroken that I've lost already in this war several of my colleagues, one of the best Ukrainian and international professionals, people who had a wide experience working in different war zones. Some of them covered the war in Ukraine since 2014. And they survived the heavy battles of 2014, such as the Battle of Ilovaisk. I'm speaking now in particular about Max Levin, a Ukrainian photographer, one of the most renowned, not just in Ukraine, but also internationally, photographers who have been killed by Russian soldiers deliberately with 2 shots in early March, while he was covering the events and while he was covering Russian occupation of Kyiv region, in just north, in the northern part of Kyiv region. Max Levin is only one of about a dozen journalists who have been killed in this war. Most of them were killed deliberately by Russian soldiers. Most of them, they were wearing recognition marks saying that they were members of the press. They were wearing also protective gear, but they were shot in the head in many cases, and were not able to survive. So this war, is extremely dangerous for journalists to cover, but also the role of journalists in this war has been difficult to exaggerate, because we know what has been happening in Mariupol, for example, about the bombings of the hospital, of residential blocks, of a drama theater, thanks to courageous work of Associated Press journalists who were there since the first day of Russian invasion of Ukraine, and who were forced to flee Mariupol after receiving threats, after receiving credible reports that Russian soldiers were hunting for them. I was never a war reporter. My specialization was always like international news, covering, working as a head of international news desk for Ukrainian media, for Hromadske TV, one of independent Ukrainian TV and multimedia outlets. And in the recent years, I've been covering Ukraine for international media, for Spanish news agency FM. Now I'm also working with various American and British media. As I said, I was never a war reporter, but somehow, like, I think every journalist now in Ukraine is a war reporter now. We didn't choose it. We had to face and accept this new reality and to adjust also the way we work because of this war. But of course, we are not only journalists, we're also citizens. So this war affects us personally. As I said, I'm losing my colleagues, I'm losing, people I knew personally in this war. And of course, my life has been upended by this war. Also, however, I consider myself privileged and lucky because, I'm in a relatively safe location in Ukraine. Not all Ukrainians can say the same about them. So I'm happy, to be joining this event today, and I'm happy to give the floor now to other speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Olga, and thank you for sharing those personal stories also with your, broader observations. It must be tough to be a war reporter if that's not something that you signed up for from the get-go, but you were forced into that role by circumstances, like many other Ukrainians who have been forced to play, soldier instead of, being farmers or whichever positions they chose in life. We're now going to turn to George Magnus. George, you're going to pivot the discussion a little bit to our main theme for today, which has to do with Xi Jinping's dilemma. So we're going to be focusing on Russia-China. Now, we know that Putin and Xi have met 38 times in person. They have a very strong friendship. They've even made pancakes together, and they've toasted their friendship with vodka. Now, some analysts are saying that the relationship between Russia and China is the strongest it's ever been in about 6 decades. And we also know that at the Winter Olympics, Putin was the first world leader who Xi met since the start of the COVID pandemic, which is quite significant. Shortly before the February escalation of this conflict, Russia and China declared a so-called quote-unquote no-limits friendship. Now, what are the defining features of the Russia-China friendship without limits relationship? And what are the main dilemmas for Xi Jinping's support for Putin? Thank you. George.
Well, thanks very much, Leon, for having me here. And I hope you won't mind if I just offer my personal thanks and actually in awe at Olga's spirit and bravery and what she represents, obviously, of the people of Ukraine. I think we all feel incredibly humble when listening to people from the front line like her. But let me go on directly to try to address some of the issues that you raise in your question, Leon, because what we've just heard actually underscores in many ways the significance of why our focus on China should be as sharp as it can be. Obviously, the talk amongst certainly Chinese and Russian officials about their long-standing friendship, of course, is complete bunk. It was never really a long-standing friendship. I mean, it was quite close after the Second World War, but as I'm sure many people know, that friendship eventually kind of fell apart. They came to blows. And there is a deep, or has been at least, a deep sort of mistrust or distrust between Russia and China over a long period of time, and a lot of competition between the two, particularly in Central Asia. But the relationship has become warmer for the last, well, I say since the perhaps the early to mid 2000s. And from that time to the present time, a lot of trade has been built up, a lot of cooperation. As you said yourself in your introduction, they've had 38 meetings. The first meeting Xi Jinping went or left China to hold when he became, when he was kind of when he ascended to power in 2012, was to Moscow to see Putin. So there's no question that the two of them regard each other as close buddies. And as allies in an anti-US, anti-European, anti-NATO front. They both see this moment. I mean, I'm not saying it was all generated by Putin's invasion of Ukraine, because it kind of pre-existed that, but they see this time as an important time when they can exploit and look to exploit opportunities captured for them by what they perceive to be the inevitable and terminal decline of the United States, or at least of the power structure in the world in which US hegemony has kind of ruled for much of the post-Second World War period. So when they talk about their friendship that goes beyond limits, I think the main thing, perhaps the only thing that binds them together, is this common stance against the United States and against, when I say the West, I don't really mean it in a geographic sense, which is, you know, the transatlantic kind of alliance of the United States and Europe, but I mean the West as in liberal-leaning democracies which actually exist throughout the world, so including in Asia and elsewhere. So this is a moment which they do seek to exploit. I've no idea, we can only speculate what Xi Jinping was told when Putin went to Beijing at the start of the Winter Olympics. But obviously things have not kind of worked out quite the way that he may have been led to believe, either by Putin or by his own intelligence officials. Should have spent much more time listening to the Pentagon. So for the time being, I think we should expect nothing more than to hear Xi Jinping echo the rhetoric of Moscow in its military adventure, and to support Russia rhetorically, if in perhaps not so obvious other ways. I don't know whether this is something that you wanted to come on to a little bit later in the discussion. I might just add, though, there hasn't really been overwhelming evidence at this point that China has offered massive or significant help to Russia that would subject China to the risk of secondary sanctions, which Chinese banks and large Chinese state enterprises have certainly shied away, as far as we can tell, from close involvement with Russian contracts, Russian energy, Russian, supplying arms and so on. I mean, there was a report over the weekend about 5 Chinese transport planes taking missile systems to Serbia. We don't really know what that was all about, whether that was trying to help Russia through the back door, or whether it was part of a contract to Serbia. Certainly I don't know, but these things, one imagines, will be very closely monitored and scrutinized by the intelligence services in the United States and elsewhere. And it is something which I think the Chinese are rather fearful of incurring unnecessary wrath and punishment by the United States. So I think we have this kind of standoff from a Beijing point of view at the moment of supporting Russia rhetorically. Perhaps smaller Russian companies are doing things below the radar, but certainly no obvious signs, as far as we can tell, that this has transcended or crossed any kind of red lines from an American point of view.
Thank you, George. Yeah, we'll definitely circle back to some of those points, especially in terms of what we've seen so far in terms of support by China. I'm going to turn now to Mariah. Mariah, you early on wrote something also about this escalation of the conflict. Now, why has the CCP been quick to dismiss comparisons between Taiwan and Ukraine in the wake of the Russian invasion? And is there a strategic motivation behind this? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for your question, Leon, and thank you for inviting me to speak today. Basically, the Russia-Ukraine war raises a lot of issues for the Chinese leadership in terms of China's claims on Taiwan. And these kind of comparisons have problematic implications. First of all, Putin's decision to recognize the independence of rebel-held provinces Donetsk and Luhansk raised questions over China's own claims on the self-ruled de facto independent Taiwan, and not even just Taiwan, but also regions like Tibet and Xinjiang and Hong Kong, as these regions have historically enjoyed varying degrees of autonomy. So it kind of raises the question, why doesn't Beijing recognize the independence of Taiwan, or indeed some of these other regions that have previously enjoyed autonomy? And due to a number of face-saving and political historical reasons, the CCP is really not keen for the international community to raise these kind of questions in the first place. The CCP's preference, and indeed many of its efforts in the form of United Front work, has concentrated on encouraging the international community and people overseas to view Taiwan naturally as a province of China in line with the One China policy. So that's one reason why the CCP is not keen on these comparisons between Ukraine and Taiwan. Another reason I think is that the CCP has been surprised. The CCP leadership has been surprised by the extent of the sanctions against Russia and the unified response of the Western democratic countries. And China is more entangled and interdependent in its trade with Western democracies than Russia is. So sanctions present very serious economic consequences for China. And it's therefore very much against the CCP's interest to have this similar unified and comprehensive international response to a potential invasion of Taiwan. So the CCP leadership has also been quick to dismiss comparisons, I think, for that reason as well. And then finally, I think these comparisons also make Russia and China out to be both aggressive authoritarian states that behave similarly in the international sphere. And I think this really goes against the image and narrative that the CCP leadership has been careful to craft, perhaps with varying success, and as an image of China as a non-interventionist state. So these kind of comparisons really undermine that image and that narrative the CCP has been trying to create. So those are the three main reasons why they're interested in dismissing these comparisons.
Thank you, Mariah. Those are some great points. We're going to go back to Olga for the time being. Olga, you've touched on a few issues related to war crimes and crimes against humanity, and anyone monitoring the news, whether from Ukraine or from afar, cannot help but pay attention to some of these reports that are coming out related to those issues. We're also seeing reports of sexual violence, including rape, as well as the forceful removal of, some say, over 120,000 children. These reports are quite disturbing. We're also now hearing allegations of the use of chemical weapons by Russia, which have not yet been confirmed. Would you care to comment about those issues for us, please?
Yes, I will start from the last question on chemical weapons. Indeed, there was yesterday a report. The source was the Azov regiment that is stationed in Mariupol, that Russian forces were using a chemical agent, and that there were some soldiers who are experiencing symptoms that are common after a chemical attack. However, that has not been corroborated by other sources, and today Ukrainian Ministry of Defense said that they are still verifying this information, and that in fact it might be that it was not the chemical agent used, but there might have been used like phosphorus bombs or other sorts of agents. However, it is still, it wouldn't be surprising if Russia at some point in this war used chemical weapons against Ukraine, because Russia repeatedly, through its officials and also its state propaganda, accused Ukraine of preparing a chemical attack. Well, they very often announce their own plans in this way. And also just yesterday, a representative of a puppet, Donetsk People's Republic, he said that Ukrainian soldiers in Mariupol should be subjected to chemical attack because, well, they are still refusing to surrender. So chemical weapons could be used against them. Well, I know, from my source, and I also covered this, I wrote about this for Time magazine, that Ukrainian doctors and Ukrainian officials have been preparing for weeks already to a possible chemical weapons attack, that Ukrainian doctors have been undergoing training also with their colleagues from Syria, Syrian doctors who have firsthand experience in treating victims of a chemical weapons attack. So Ukraine has also been provided, as stated by NATO Secretary General, with some equipment, protective equipment in a case of a chemical weapon attack, and also with some antidotes that can be used to treat the victims. So while this information is not confirmed about chemical weapons attack in Mariupol, it wouldn't be surprising at some point if Russia indeed used these weapons. And of course, as you said, we are receiving a lot of reports, and more evidence is emerging of Russian war crimes. The most, of course, reports and evidence is coming from areas that have been under Russian occupation in the initial phase of this war: Kyiv region, Chernihiv region, Kharkiv region, Sumy region, also some parts of Mykolaiv region in the south. There are reports, and there are photos and videos and testimonies, interviews who talk about extrajudicial killings, about civilians being, executed with their hands tied behind their backs. Just today, another car was discovered close to Kyiv, where all the family was shot down, including women and children. So people who are trying to evacuate, who are trying to flee the area that has been affected by the fighting, they were just executed by Russian soldiers. And numerous reports of rape, including rape of minors, boys and girls, also elderly people, and adult women. This is the information coming from the Ukrainian ombudsman, Lyudmila Denisova. Every day, she's disclosing some, more details of different cases. There are also reports of numerous victims of sexual violence being pregnant as a result of these acts. Really, it looks like an orchestrated, deliberate campaign aimed at intimidation, aimed at, breaking Ukrainian resistance. All these cases are now being, the evidence is being collected, and they are being registered by Ukrainian authorities. There is also, as far as I know, an international presence of, international observers who are helping Ukrainian authorities with documenting these cases. There is also a big effort by the Ukrainian human rights defenders who have been active since 2014, since Russia first invaded Ukraine, and similar crimes were registered in the occupied Donetsk and Luhansk regions. So the same, human rights defenders who are working on these cases since 2014, they are continuing this. They are continuing to do that now, and they, of course, are overwhelmed by work because there are so many more instances of this. There is, of course, a debate how these crimes should be qualified. Are they crimes against humanity? Do they amount to genocide? I think as we get, more information about them, about the scale of these crimes, about their systemic nature, about their deliberate nature, we can speak with more confidence about that. But some scholars have said that at least it looks like that many of these crimes, they had a genocidal intent. So that's for the academics, and then to work it out how to frame these crimes. But we are also hearing from the rhetoric coming out from Russian state officials and from Russian propaganda that justifies the killing of civilians in Ukraine because they are branded as Nazis. They are basically dehumanized, and these crimes are being justified, and basically the victims are blamed for that they deserved this treatment.
Thank you, Olga, for that overview. And this issue of genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, we keep on returning to those issues during these dialogues, and it's definitely something that we want to discuss further in other panels. So thank you for raising those. George, you just heard what Olga said in terms of these major atrocities. Now, could you walk us through the main reasons why China would not immediately ditch Russia as a partner? I guess I want to try and understand under what circumstances we can expect rifts to develop between Russia and China, and when will this relationship become expensive for China, essentially? Thank you, George.
Well, as I said before, I don't expect, and I don't think we should expect, Xi Jinping to walk away or back away from Putin for the foreseeable future. I think it's very unlikely. There is a point at which Putin could become too toxic, even for China. I think that's quite possible. But until or unless something like that were to happen, I think that it is far too dangerous for Xi Jinping personally to walk away or back away from having basically made his bed, in effect, with Putin, particularly this year in 2022. The end of this year is the 20th Party Congress of the Chinese Communist Party, where Xi Jinping is going to expect to be crowned, in effect, for an unprecedented, at least since Deng Xiaoping's era, an unprecedented third term, so to speak, quote unquote, which effectively means that he could remain as president and chairman. Well, his power rests from his Communist Party position and his chairman of the military commission in China, not necessarily from his presidency, but he could remain China's head of state forever, having abandoned term limits for this particular position. So this is a really important year, and already, a year or 18 months of preparation has gone into preparing for this event at the end of 2022. So for Xi Jinping to become embarrassed or to be sort of cast as, a man of uncertainty or volatility by his potential opponents in the party as a result of, having backed Putin to the hilt rhetorically and then kind of backing away from him. I mean, I don't think that's just going to happen at all. Of course, it's a confusing situation for China, not confusing, but awkward situation, because of the way that things are evolving in Ukraine. Beijing now kind of finds itself in a position where its rhetoric is pretty much cast in stone, but its actions are not quite in sync with the rhetoric. So I already talked about large Chinese SOEs that are not fulfilling their contracts to buy Chinese commodities. Sinopec, for example, China's biggest oil and gas company, has just kind of refused to develop further its investment in Russia. There have been reports about Chinese companies not delivering aircraft parts to Russia. And other, Chinese banks have been studiously avoiding financing of commodity purchases from Russia. So these things we don't, as I said, we don't really know what's going on under the radar or behind the scenes, so to speak. But certainly the things that we do know about suggest that the relationship is awkward for China. And why wouldn't it be? Because China is what it is because of its engagement with the rest of the world through multilateral institutions and through importing technology and know-how, which it needs really, really badly. I mean, China's trade with Russia is about $150 billion bilaterally, so that's exports and imports. With the United States and Europe, it's 1.3 trillion, so that's 20 times as big. Plus, of course, China's need for access to US dollars, China's need for investment flows. They treasure really their kind of foreign investment and particularly financial company investment at the moment that's going into China. So there is a point, I think, at which if China were at risk of being, when I say excommunicated, I mean it in the sense of like, if decoupling gets to the point where nationalists in China try to disengage it from the rest of the world, and if the United States and Europe and others, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and so on, kind of push China further and further away, I mean, that cost may at some point be so big that China might have to reconsider, its position. But I don't think that's a position which they want to confront or are prepared to confront, certainly for the time being.
Thank you, George. It's interesting. I mean, a large part of the dilemma, again, that you highlight for Xi Jinping is this tension between its political interest to support Putin and its anti-US or Western platform versus its economic ambitions. But what strikes me as absent is that there's no mention that these human rights atrocities that we've been talking about features in China's bigger picture of this conflict. But maybe we can circle back to that issue at some point. Let's turn to Mariah again. Mariah, what lessons do you think the CCP leadership is drawing from Russia's invasion of Ukraine regarding their own territorial ambitions on Taiwan?
Yes, thank you for your question, Leon. I think this actually ties in a lot with what George was alluding to in his answer to the previous question, which basically I think the CCP leadership is doing a thorough reassessment of China's own vulnerabilities within the international system. As George already alluded to, I think there is a kind of debate probably happening within the CCP leadership over how to weather possible sanctions from Western democracies if China was to take military action towards Taiwan. And there's the debate is greater interdependence going to work, or should we push for greater decoupling? And the answer really seems to be greater decoupling. And we see some evidence of this in a number of ways. Number one is that the CCP leadership is going to expedite the removal of things like Microsoft Windows software from Chinese government computers. And this is something that's been in place and ongoing since the 1980s. As George alluded to, Chinese banks are very nervous about crossing the sanctions line, as they need to be able to deal in US dollars. So it basically, I think China's really looking carefully at how the West has responded to this invasion, and they're doing a thorough reassessment of what they could be vulnerable to and what adjustments they might have to make if they were to face similar action in response to an invasion in Taiwan. And one of those responses is we need to improve greater self-sufficiency. And Xi Jinping already in early March has been calling for China to reduce its dependence on foreign agricultural markets. And he was quoted as saying, the rice bowls of the Chinese people must be filled with Chinese grain. And this was something that was particularly important because Russia and Ukraine are both major wheat producers. And now China has a target for self-sufficiency to produce about 95% of grain consumed. But over the last few years, that number has just been around 80%. So I think as China's watching this situation unfold, the main messages are, pushing for greater decoupling in line with what they've seen happen in the Western response to Ukraine, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and a push for greater self-sufficiency. Yeah.
Thank you. So decoupling and self-sufficiency, Mariah. I'm going to turn back to Olga. Olga, I don't know if you would like to add anything to the debate with regards to the lessons that China is learning from Russia. I know that you were also very much in the disinformation domain, so perhaps you would like to speak to that. And before you answer, I'd just like to ask all the panelists from here on going forward just to keep your answers fairly brief, then we can take a few questions also from our audience. So Olga, I'll give the floor to you. Thank you.
Yes, well, already before this full-scale invasion of Ukraine, me and other disinformation researchers, we were noticing that, Chinese are learning from Russians in terms of, how to conduct disinformation operations and disinformation campaigns on social media. They've been using, this inauthentic accounts, networks of automated accounts similar to what Russia has been using for years, and in order to spread like the disinformation and propaganda. And especially with the invasion of Ukraine, it has become evident also, how closely Chinese propaganda is working with Russian propaganda, and how they are repeating similar narratives, very often anti-Western narratives, anti-NATO narratives. And we've also seen that representatives of Chinese media, state-controlled, obviously media, they are working very often embedded with Russian soldiers in the areas that have been occupied, by Russian military in Ukraine. Chinese media almost do not work on Ukrainian government-controlled territories, but they are working and they are present in the areas that have been taken by Russian soldiers. And it is actually very interesting because before the invasion, China was trying also to increase its presence, its influence in Ukraine, also in the information domain. Several of my colleagues, journalists, they were contacted recently over the last year by representatives of China's state media who were keen on recruiting people in Ukraine in order to expand their broadcasting in Ukrainian language. There is an international radio of China that has Ukrainian edition. And, they were looking for people who would be translating some of the content and sharing this content in Ukraine and working in the, Ukrainian editions of Chinese state-controlled media. Well, of course, it always came with strings attached. So while, the initial agreement would be that the journalists would be free in, making like the editorial choices, but then in the end, it was clear that they would be mostly translating, Chinese pro-communist party propaganda, and will have like really limited freedom of the work. So and it's very interesting, to see how these attempts of China also in the information domain to gain some like sympathy of Ukrainian audience, of the Ukrainian public, they are actually now being undermined by this collective effort of Chinese state media, of the work of Chinese so-called journalists from the state media alongside Russian soldiers in Ukraine.
Thank you, Olga. Thank you. I'm going to turn now to George again. Here's a comment from Professor Lee Jones from Queen Mary University of London. And he's alluding to something that you've touched on. He says, surely China's position is far more complex than simply a pro-Russian stance. It claims a no-limit partnership, and yet the MFA has called in the national oil companies, warning them of additional investments. And as you say, there's no evidence of Chinese aid to Russia. So clearly, there are indeed limits to the partnership. So what are these limits, and why do they exist? Thank you, George. Over to you.
Yeah. Sorry. well, I hope I have kind of addressed them actually in the second round of questions to a degree. Yeah, I mean, it's not a simple, pro-Russia message, because actually China's interest is to emerge from the Ukraine war with China as a winner. That's really what Beijing wants. China was always the dominant partner in the Sino-Russian relationship, with Russia now being a pariah state and a vassal state in effect of China. I mean, the Chinese have pretty much got what they want. They have the power, they have the leverage. They could basically use that leverage against Putin if they chose to do so. But they want to come out of it stronger, and they want to come out of it as in a kind of a stronger position vis-a-vis the United States. That's really the only thing they care about, to be honest. So I do think that the relationship with Russia is a tool for them to further that interest. And I think there is, I mean, I did allude to the awkwardness that I think obtains in Beijing, which I think is about the fact that they are trying to balance here their political support and rhetoric in favor of Putin and of this sort of anti-US, stance to make the world safe for autocracy. But at the same time, they're deeply conscious of the economic costs that would be pretty heavy, not just for them, for everybody, but certainly for them, if they were to incur secondary sanctions, if they were to fall foul of the United States and the EU, for example. And I think that would be something that they'd have to weigh that pretty carefully. I mean, it may well be, as Mariah already said, that they will choose to sort of go down the self-reliance route, and that they will now look for even more strenuously ways to insulate themselves from the risk of financial sanctions, capture of the reserves, and so on and so forth. I'm not sure these things can be very successful, to be honest. China imports more semiconductors from the West, quote unquote, than it does oil from anybody else. So its dependence on Western technology, Western know-how is still pretty robust.
Thank you, George. Mariah, I'm going to turn to you again. What's been the response of the Taiwanese government to what's happening in Ukraine, and what might be their strategy moving forward?
Thank you again for your question. So, I mean, I think from a military and security perspective, the Taiwanese leadership has definitely been taking this parallel between Russia and Ukraine and China, Taiwan quite seriously. One of the main things that they were quite alarmed by is the US's decision not to intervene militarily in Ukraine. And this has really prompted the Taiwanese to rethink their defense strategy if the US did not intervene, if China invaded Taiwan. And so the Taiwanese defense minister has already said that the island is considering extending its compulsory military service. And originally this military service for young people was 4 months, but now they're considering extending it to a year. President Tsai Ing-wen has also requested a drafting of a report called from the National Security Council, just looking again at Taiwan's defense budget, its defense procurement, its conscription, etc., and just kind of reassessing, what its own self-defense capabilities would be realistically if there was an invasion from China and without the support or intervention of the US. But to set aside the military aspects, more broadly speaking, the Taiwanese have been very keen to use this situation as a way of advancing democratic diplomacy. Now, democratic diplomacy is basically an approach which proactively markets Taiwanese democracy in the international sphere as a way of positioning or communicating that Taiwan's status as a separate country from China, which is by contrast authoritarian. And this is evident in the fact that, Taiwan's been highlighting the fact that it's a responsible, proactive, democratic actor It's sharing expertise on disinformation and cyber attacks with countries across Europe in response to what's been happening in Ukraine. And then Taiwan's also been aligning itself very much with EU democratic countries in this conflict. Literally, the foreign minister said that Taiwan stands with Ukraine as a fellow frontline state combating authoritarian expansion. They've donated about $31 million to Ukraine. They've also followed other Western democracies in terms of banning exports of certain high-tech products to Russia. So Taiwan's been really keen to position itself on the democracy side, of this conflict, and it does definitely draw parallels in order to increase concern and awareness over Taiwan's international status. And this is very much something that the CCP wants people not to be so aware of. They would, as I mentioned earlier, Chinese Communist Party has been working very hard to make it common knowledge overseas that that Taiwan is a province of China when actually, it's a de facto independent state. So that's Taiwan's counter strategy in response to that.
Thank you. Thank you, Mariah. I'm going to turn to George first, and we'll because I want to close off finally with Olga. So I'll first go back to George. I'll ask you two interconnected two questions. One is from Deborah James. Can you please speak to what is perceived as the desire on China's part to drive a wedge between the EU and US relationship in order to gain some leverage in its aspiration for closer ties with the EU, and the contradiction of that relationship and China's previously stated opposition to NATO? And then we have a question from Lucas Fiala from our IDEAS China Foresight team. Will China see sanctions on Russian US dollar reserves as an opportunity to international the one, or will Beijing want to retain a closer grip on capital flows? What might this do to US dominance as a reserve currency? Maybe you can answer both those questions, George.
Yep. Well, the latter is one of my favorite questions. The former is a good question, actually. As I'm sure everybody knows, quite recently there was a China-EU summit, which was held remotely. I mean, in the end, it was a bit of a disaster, really. I mean, the Chinese certainly had an interest. They do have an interest, obviously, to drive a wedge between the United States and the EU. And they want to resurrect the now kind of suspended or gathering dust CAI, the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment, which is a bilateral investment treaty, which has been years in the making, and which was finally got to the point where they thought it might be agreed at the end of last year, when the Chinese put on sanctions against European parliamentarians and against other European persons and entities over the controversy about Xinjiang. So the Europeans basically, I mean, I assume it was all very polite, but the Europeans wanted to talk about Ukraine, which the Chinese didn't. They wanted to talk about lifting sanctions on EU entities and persons, which the Chinese didn't. They wanted to talk about other things which are pretty sensitive at the moment, which the Chinese didn't. And so, I think the general consensus was really that that it made no progress at all. It was a bit of a waste of time. And there is obviously a big change going on in terms of EU and particularly German views about China and about the previous kind of regime, basically, in which it was business above everything. I think that is changing, and I speak to a lot of European companies in China, and they are having a rethink about China's strategy and about how they should be positioned. And let's not forget, that not everything is going swimmingly in China at the moment anyway. The economy is in bad shape. COVID is causing them all manner of problems, particularly in Shanghai and lots of other cities. And so this kind of slowdown, or the not slowdown, but the risk of being sort of further compromised by actions or being frozen out, as it were, from commercial and financial relationship is something which they really don't like. On the subject of the yuan, yeah, I mean the Chinese, ever since the financial crisis in 2008, the Chinese have been gagging really to try to end the dollar system. They don't like it. They don't, they think it confers too much power to the United States, correctly, and they want, the sort of at least a multipolar currency system in which the yuan would play a bigger role. The trouble is they're pursuing policies which are guaranteed to restrict the yuan from becoming significantly more used internationally. Basically, we don't want to get into the long grass of this particular thorny question, but basically you have to have open capital movements, which they don't like, or you have to have current account imbalances, deficits to provide renminbi to foreigners, which they don't like either. So I think the prospect of this is happening is pretty slim, but I don't think we should fault the Chinese for trying to want to de-dollarize their own system, to get more countries like Russia, Venezuela, North Korea, and other countries like that to participate more in a renminbi type of system. But I think it's pledged, almost doomed to become, a very, very kind of low-tier, second-rate type of system.
Thank you, George. While we're talking about EU relations also, Mariah, I'm going to ask you one final question. If you keep your answer short, please. How might Russia's invasion of Ukraine impact Taiwan's broader relationship with EU countries? Thank you.
Okay. So, I mean, I think it's going to be a similar kind of pattern that I alluded to before, which is in line with Taiwan's broader strategy of democratic diplomacy, which was in place under the previous DPP administration under Chen Shui-bian back in the early 2000s, which is to position Taiwan and communicate Taiwan's separateness in the form of its democracy, through its dealings with other states. So I really think a similar pattern is unfolding, in Taiwan's broader relationship with EU countries. This is evident in the fact that, Taiwan the Ministry of Foreign Affairs has made a second donation of like $11.5 million for Ukrainian refugees and held an event which featured, the head of the Taiwan offices from the Czech Republic, Hungary, Lithuania, Poland, and Slovakia. And then President Tsai also met with the National Endowment for Democracy President and Chief Exec, Damon Wilson, on the 29th of March. And the National Endowment for Democracy cooperates with Finland and Sweden and Ukraine. So these all underscore Taiwan's very firm commitment to advancing, cooperation among democracies and being a proactive player in that process. And even prior to the Russia-Ukraine conflict, EU countries were already showing more support for Taiwan and risking China's anger. There was unprecedented support for Taiwan's entry into the World Health Organization and World Health Assembly during the COVID-19 outbreak. And then also Lithuania decided to stick to its guns on maintaining the title for Taiwan's de facto embassy there, which I think was the Taiwan Representative Office, rather than the usual, Taipei Cultural and Economic Office or the Taipei Representative Office. No, the Lithuania went for Taiwan Representative Office. So I think all these things mean that that it's going to carry on in this sort of direction where Taiwan is really positioning itself on the democracy side with regards to its EU partnerships.
Thank you, Mariah. Olga, I started with you and I'd like to finish with you. I'd like to give you the last word for today. Now, we know that the Russia-Ukraine war will be entering another very crucial phase over the coming weeks. What is your main message, Olga, to NATO member states and those of us who care about this conflict?
Well, I think my message will not be very different from the message that Ukrainian officials are issuing. And this is the message that this is not just Ukraine's fight, this is not just Ukraine's war. Ukraine is defending democracy. It's at the forefront of, this battle, which might be a defining battle of the century between democracy and authoritarianism. And, the result of this war will have global repercussions. It will not only affect, Ukraine and Ukrainians. It will affect many other countries. It will affect, the international system, the international order, and hopefully lead also to its overhaul and its revision, as we are now seeing multiple flaws in the, with international institutions that are not functioning as they should in order to, prevent such atrocities from happening. And my message would be, of course, that since it's not just Ukraine's fight, Ukraine should be given, but Ukrainians are fighting and Ukrainians are dying. They should be given everything in order to be able to defend themselves and to defend the free and civilized world. It's very frustrating to the need to repeat all the time that we need more, military equipment. And this is not just heavy weapons. Ukrainian soldiers need everything from bulletproof vests to night vision equipment to tactical medicine kits. It's still Ukrainian volunteers and Ukrainian charities who are raising the money, and this money are donated mostly by Ukrainian citizens to provide these items for Ukrainian soldiers, because the assistance that has been coming from the West is not enough even to cover the most basic needs. And then, of course, Ukraine needs more heavy weapons. Ukraine needs tanks, air defense systems, fighter jets. And of course, what Ukraine needs is more severe sanctions on Russia and oil embargo, other, actions and other sanctions that would cripple Russian economy and would stop, the flow of money to fund Russian war machine that is responsible for slaughter of civilians in Ukraine.
Thank you, Olga. I would like to thank all three of our panelists, but especially you, Olga. And my thoughts are with you and your family, and also your fellow journalists in Ukraine who have gone from covering very ordinary issues to a constant state of war. The work that you're doing is very much important, and I also want to appeal to our audience who are not yet following you on Twitter and social media to follow you so that they can get firsthand reports of what's happening in the field. I get concerned when I still hear people saying, well, we don't know what's happening exactly in Ukraine. There is a lot of information out there. There's a lot of credible information out there. So I would appeal to those people to also follow Olga. Your work is tremendously important during this time. So thank you so much for humbling us by being part of this important discussion. And thank you, George and Mariah, also for your wonderful insights and contributions. I'd like to also remind our audience members that LSE Student Union set up a charity to support Ukrainian refugees. There's a link, I believe, in the chat function, so please click on that if you would like to support that. And please join us again next Tuesday for another Russia-Ukraine dialogue. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.